Hello everyone. I don't know how closely you are following the LA riots, but one of the things that I find particularly stunning and particularly jaw-dropping is the stunning incompetence of the mayor of Los Angeles, Karen Bass. She has failed several times, and when she fails, lots of people are uncovering some of the suspicious ties of her past. They did so when she failed during the California wildfires, but also now when she has failed repeatedly to address the LA riots properly. So we have an article here from the Daily Mail called "Disturbing Secret History of Woke LA Mayor Karen Bass Resurfaces Amid Immigration Riots." So what is this thing? It says that basically she was tied to the Venceremos group, a socialist group. And not only was she tied there, she visited Cuba in the 1970s despite it being illegal for US citizens to do so, to travel to Cuba. And she also went there to Fidel Castro's funeral. As the article says here, she previously praised Fidel Castro and had close associations with a Caribbean country in her youth, traveling there in 1973 with Venceremos Brigade and seeing the communist leader speak. In 2016, when Castro died, she referred to him as Comandante en Jefe, Commander-in-Chief, saying his passing was a great loss to the people of Cuba. She also reportedly gave a eulogy for a senior member of the Communist Party, USA. That's not particularly good on her CV, if you ask me. I wouldn't want my mayor to be someone who has communist ties, let alone someone who expresses affiliation for communist dictators. So what was this Venceremos Brigade and what is it still? So if we go to its website, it says here basically over 50 years of solidarity with Cuba. And it was formed in 1969. It was a coalition of young people that formed the Venceremos Brigade as an act of solidarity with the Cuban Revolution by working side by side with Cuban workers and challenging US policies towards Cuba, including the economic blockade and the US government's ban on travel to the island. Now, let me just put one thing into context. Cuba was a communist country close to the US, and in 1962-63 there was the Cuban Missile Crisis. Cuba had nuclear warheads from the USSR and aided the USSR in order to blackmail the US. There was a huge problem there. So in the 60s, where this happened, we have this Venceremos group that was trying to say, well, let's try to present the Cuban Revolution as more palatable than it actually was to the evil anti-communist Americans. Right, so it says, the people who came together to initiate this project represented a broad cross-section of the radical movements of the era. They were members of Students for a Democratic Society, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the Communist Party, the Black Panther Party, the Young Lords, and other organizations on the front lines of the struggles for socialism and against racism, sexism, and US imperialism and war. So basically, they were socialists. She was involved in a socialist group, an openly socialist group, and she traveled there and expressed admiration for Fidel Castro. Now, a lot of people are saying things about the ties of the Venceremos group to other groups, and they make allegations that one of the major parts of the operation of the Venceremos Brigade was to radicalize young leftists in order for them to become far leftist extremists who were going to fight the Western side in the Cold War and be pro-communist forces and against what they called US imperialism and in favor of what communists at the time said anti-imperialism, which basically was a form like communist imperialism. So I'm not going to say all of the allegations. One of them has to do with some suspected ties to M19, the group that bombed the US Capitol in 1983. But I'm just going to mention it without saying whether it's actual or not, because from a cursory look, I can see something that said that she was directly involved with respect to mentoring people who were parts of these communist groups that were allegedly mentored by the Venceremos Brigade. So I'm going to take all these allegations and put them aside and talk to you about an article from The Atlantic from January 2020, which essentially says that she was really close to becoming Biden's VP pick. According to the article, in 1973, Karen Bass, who's now a potential Biden VP pick, traveled to Cuba with the Venceremos Brigade. I didn't have any illusions that the people in Cuba had the same freedoms I did, she said. Karen Bass, the congresswoman from California, is in contention to becoming Joe Biden's running mate. I mean, if you see the Tim Walz, who allowed Minnesota to burn during the BLM riots, became Kamala Harris's VP pick, you may see an evolving Democrat tradition there. There are good reasons for this. She's reliably liberal, she chairs the Congressional Black Caucus, and she shares a history of family loss with Biden. But she's also the only person on Biden's list who spent part of the 70s working construction in Fidel Castro's Cuba with the Venceremos Brigade, a group that has organized annual trips to Cuba for young leftist Americans for half a century. The Biden campaign knows about Bass's history with the brigade, which began as a joint venture of the Castro government and Students for a Democratic Society, the leftist anti-war organization that gave birth to the Weather Underground terrorist group, according to The Atlantic. She told Biden's vetting committee weeks ago that this was probably going to come up. So far, it hasn't been a deal breaker. In fact, her potential to drive up African American votes might help in Florida among voters who traditionally haven't been paid as much attention in the state. It's a reflection of the changing politics around Cuba that Biden would consider a running mate whose past might hurt his chances in Florida, where anti-Castro Cubans are still an important constituency. In 1992, being associated with the Venceremos Brigade was enough to prevent Jonetta Cole, the then president of Spelman College, who was coordinating education policy for Bill Clinton's transition team, from being nominated to serve as Secretary of Education. So what was a huge problem for Bill Clinton's administration with respect to making someone Secretary of Education wasn't so much of a problem for Biden as far as picking his VP was concerned. So that was a problem. Eventually, Biden didn't pick her. We don't know if that was the reason, but there does seem to be a very huge swing towards the far left in American politics. Right, so this isn't the only so-called suspicious ties of Karen Bass. She's also said to be a member of the advisory board of the NED, National Endowment for Democracy. Now, let me say, from a look of it, it doesn't seem to be that problematic. The NED doesn't seem to be something like the Venceremos Brigade. Let's be honest. It's not. But the reason why people mention it is because the NED, the National Endowment for Democracy, has been associated with so-called color revolutions that were non-violent protests around the world, particularly in the countries that were in the sphere of influence of the ex-USSR. And that means that she has ties to a group that is really closely affiliated with organizing protests. So she may have know-how with respect to organizing LA protests right now. And obviously there's the danger of these protests disintegrating into riots. So she visited Castro's funeral, but that was the only thing that she visited. And her major, in a sense, PR failure up until the LA riots was her handling of the California wildfires, which in fact was a non-handling because she was absent. She was in Ghana. And we see here Los Angeles Mayor Karen Bass is facing criticism over the timing of her recent trip to Ghana and budget cuts that hampered the city's fire department from doing its job amid the ongoing citywide blaze. The mayor's poorly timed foreign travel has raised questions about her priorities and similar past trips. So why was she in Ghana? She was in Ghana because she was celebrating, let me show you here, She was in Ghana to attend the inauguration of Ghana's president, John Dramani Mahama, on Saturday, January 4th. And he is suspected to be a socialist president, and this adds to the mix that says that implies heavily that she has very much of a socialist temperament. Right, so let's bear all this into account when we are judging her response now to the LA riots. So instantly she said to the immigrant community in Los Angeles, "You belong here, you're not alone, Los Angeles and your home, and we are fighting for you." So she is a huge part of the leftist narrative, according to which the situation is under control, and the protests disintegrated into riots when Trump declared that he would deploy the National Guards. And essentially this shows that what she and Newsom try to do is to simultaneously play two audiences. Number one, they want to seem really proficient with respect to handling a crisis while blaming Trump for the riots. And number two, they want to actually claim that they are giving voice to the so-called unheard. So they're trying to play two audiences. The audience that wants law and order, and the audience that is essentially targeted by the ICE raids, or the audience that has affiliations to people who are targeted by ICE's operations. And let us be very clear. Part of Trump's mandate has been to conduct deportations where deportations are deemed to be necessary. So let us see here what Mayor Karen Bass says. Angelinos are trying to live their lives, going to work, caring for their families, while facing the constant threat of sudden immigration crackdowns. This fear paralyzes community. We saw it before. Kids too scared to go to school, families torn apart without warning. Let's not pretend this is about public safety. It's political retribution, plain and simple. I think that this is essentially the reverse tactic. This is just projection. You don't capitulate on mobs. And in fact, this seems to be what she's doing here when she is saying that the looting of the Nike store was provoked by the White House. I think that this says everything we need to know. First of all, she's dressed here in an outfit that seems to resemble the Mexican flag. Maybe she needs a bit red to do this, but it seems something that I cannot not notice, let me say. And when she shifts blame from the violence of the mob to Trump, she's actually pandering to the mob. And this is disastrous, and this is something that she should know about. She should know better, and that's why I say that her incompetence seems frankly unbelievable. Why? Because you don't capitulate to mobs. Even if you agree with some things that mobs say, there is a huge problem with mobs. You know what that is? Mobs are mobs. You don't validate mobocracy because mobs are, generally speaking, stupid, and even if you agree with them in some cases, they are incredibly manipulable, emotionally speaking, and they can change. They're incredibly volatile. They're not stable. So as a responsible leader, you don't shift the blame away from the rioters into law enforcement agents. She is essentially trying to portray these riots as the expression of those who are unheard. But this is far from being the case. We hear all the time about mass migration. The US citizens hear all the time about mass migration, and they have heard about it. And in fact, this is precisely why they voted for Trump, who promised them that he is going to conduct deportations and deal with the issue of illegal migration. Because let's face it, without borders, without a sane border policy, there is no country. And she says here, our law enforcement officers can handle this. Well, if they can handle this, why are ye shifting responsibility away from the mob to Trump? Why are you doing this? You don't elevate the mob as far as public discussion is concerned. The mob is a mob. And I think that this is a very reckless game that the Democrats are playing because they want to present themselves, number one, as able to handle crisis, which aids their image, let's say, for the 2028 elections, but also they want to capitalize upon the resentment of people against Trump and also present themselves as those who are very much attentive to the voices of the, within quotation marks, unheard, who are essentially those who are very much threatened by Trump's insistence on voter ID laws in California that Newsom and Bass are against, and also by the operation of ICE. And I want to say that there is a very different approach to law enforcement represented by Sheriff Chad Bianco of California Riverside. That is actually the approach I'm in favor of. And I want to hear what he has to say, and I think that you will absolutely like what he said.
The thing is in 2020, it did happen. The same thing that happened in Los Angeles spilled into Riverside, and we handled it completely different than them. We handled it with an overwhelming show of force where we ended what they were doing immediately, and it disappeared. And what happened was the rest of law enforcement said, oh, look what they did. It worked. And so Los Angeles followed suit, and they were able to stop theirs within 2 days after ours. So there's already a playbook. You do not allow them to escalate and then bring more reinforcements into the criminal behavior. It's nothing but criminals that are enabled to do criminal behavior. And if they're allowed, they will continue and they will get bigger in numbers. If you stop it in the beginning, then it goes away. That's how things should be done. Any cop on the street will tell you exactly how they can make it end. But somehow, as you rise up through the leadership ranks, they can't make those decisions at the top because politics get involved. The mayor gets involved. The governor gets involved.
Yeah.
I think he's absolutely correct. You don't allow this to escalate, because if you allow this to escalate, you have all sorts of antisocial elements that are trying to capitalize upon that situation and drag the city into deeper and worse chaos. Now, what this shows is that the left is playing a very reckless game. The left is purposefully trying to conceal the issue of habituation from its own narrative, because they're trying to portray themselves as being the sensitive and the attentive ones, those who want to give voice to the voiceless. But this is very, very deceptive. The fundamental issue about legislation is not intention, but actually the habituation of people. And the same applies to policy. So when your policy is to constantly shift away responsibility from mobs and blame law enforcement agents, you are habituating people into saying and thinking that mobocracy gets you to places. You are making them think that if they want to get things done, they need to organize into mobs. And also, you may communicate to them that if they are very much against the current government, you are their voice. And you may sort of give them a subtle signal that maybe I'm your person, I'm your man, I'm your woman. So I'm very much in favor of Sheriff Chad Bianco's approach. And I'd say in the Chad versus Karen dilemma, I think I vote for Chad.